Well, joining me now with greater perspective on these moves is Cremen from AdviceWorx. Caroline, hi. Good to chat to you. Of course, Nedbank has been the big story, and those headline earnings per share relatively flat, but there was the eco-back factor to, well, factor in, I suppose. Hi.
Yeah, definitely. If you strip out the EcoBank transaction, the headline earnings are up 12%, and I think that actually surprised the market quite a bit. So I think relatively boring set of results, but boring in a good way. You know, you saw a lot of cost discipline, you saw their interest earnings up, you saw their non-interest revenue up as well, especially in the corporate investment banking space, where it was up 11%. So I think, yeah, surprised the market. I don't know what the market is anticipating for Nedbank, that they were so negative about it, but an okay set of results, in my opinion.
Yeah, and something to watch next time around as well is this whole NCBA transaction is being concluded now, and that's only going to help.
Yeah, you know, we've seen so many people go into Africa with great hopes, and I hope it works out for them. But, you know, if you look at their compatriots, these things don't always tend to be very good.
Yeah.
We'll wait and see.
Yeah,
I'm not buying anything for that reason. I mean, because they're going to Kenya. We'll wait and see. I think I'll wait and see on that one.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, noted. Right, the JSE's got its own results out today. Not bad at all.
Yeah, no, that one I was actually a little bit more excited about, because I think the last time I spoke about JSE on Business Day TV, we was very negative about it. It really looked like the exchange was dying, right? So I think they're the beneficiaries of higher market activity. You know, the commodity trades obviously assisted of them during that period. But I mean, what is really nice is growth across all their product lines. You know, they don't only have trading. So that was actually really nice. Their non-trading income was up 8% year on year, and that was 659 million of about, I think, about 2 billion. So they've really made a concerted effort to actually broaden their product base. And you've got their bond, you know, bits and pieces which are adding to that, and also the structured product listings. I think it's almost just like everybody's listing like an exchange traded fund and things these days. So they found a way to actually get out of that kind of we're losing listed companies malaise, and they're actually really making it work. Headline earnings up 18%. I thought it was really good, and they were cost control as well. So the JSE is not dead yet.
Well, good for them. And I mean, I must admit, you're quite right, some strong results. Just looking at the Middle East now, and we started our bulletin earlier on today talking about that. And let's be honest, they have these talks underway, or do they? Because Iran says we know nothing about this. But it's not our first rodeo with this whole thing. Caroline, how do you see markets fitting into this? Because the oil price does come down every time they talk. But let's be honest about it. I'd be very surprised if we get anywhere.
Yeah, look, oil price almost did nothing. I think, again, people are just having fatigue about this. And something made me laugh this morning. I mean, I read something from somebody from Deutsche Bank, and they said for one day at least, there were falling oil prices, lower inflation, stronger growth, declining bond yields, rising equities, all at the same time. But he says a nice way to start August, if you could feel it go either way very quickly, and that's probably the same as the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, okay. We'll just keep watching the wires to see what happens there. We do have some earnings coming out, SpaceX and AMD earnings later on. That should be quite exciting, especially SpaceX, because they started out with that high IPO, and then things didn't go so well. Let's see what happens. What's your take?
So I think there's two things to be aware of that are not necessarily SpaceX-y inclined. Okay, I mean, just remember the shares. I think they were about 225, trading at 110 now, so they've halved from their high. So there are a lot of options written on SpaceX, as you would be on a share that is volatile. So in the last 2 days of the month, I think there are about 37 million short puts that were actually written. That said, in total, the calls on SpaceX are about 600,000 versus 200,000 puts. So people are far more bullish than they are negative. But just bear in mind that that derivatives market can actually create something quite volatile. The other thing as well is that there was that IPO lockup, and I think that ends on the 6th of August.
Yeah.
So that's going to release about 90 million shares possibly into the market as well. So I think whatever kind of moves we see in the share price this week, it might not only be reflective of what's actually happening at the company. On the AMD side, so just on the AMD side, and this is where, like, long may this last, it's up 126% year to date. People are expecting revenue growth of between 46 to 47% and earnings growth up sharply from the previous year. If they miss slightly, because this is really when we say something's priced to perfection, this is it. It could really create quite a negative impact on the rest of the market. So let's watch that closely.
Yeah, that's a very exciting one, actually. And then, of course, we've had these Google, Anthropic, Meta, all going to see the US president to say, we've got a bit of a problem. 2 of our AI initiatives actually escaped and penetrated into other companies. Now, I'm not sure if this will affect stock prices, but it's a very interesting development, Caroline.
Yeah, it is a very interesting development. And if you're as old as I am, you remember the Terminator movies and how that all started, right? So I don't think this is quite that yet. But, the nice thing is they do have somebody relatively friendly in the White House. And friendly as in this is not a White House that is going to be regulation heavy. They're going to probably leave it up to these guys to actually develop some type of testing framework rather than mandating this is what you're going to do. I think it's actually quite positive for these companies because it allows them to kind of establish the parameters without having, very, very heavy burdensome regulation as they might have had under the Biden administration. So, yeah.
Get ahead of the curve.
Get ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, before we move on to your stock pick, let's take a moment to touch on which counters your industry peers are watching closely, Caroline.
My colleague sat next to me and said, wow, we should maybe buy some Mondi.
Okay.
And we didn't. And then subsequent to that, Mondi's also came with a good set of results. So that market has been in oversupply. And honestly, the business itself has been struggling since they've had to sell off their Russian assets, essentially for nothing. But they've sort of been calling a turnaround as the marginal players get wiped out of the market, which happens reasonably quickly, and that the pricing in corrugated and pulp should turn, and it's clear that trend is starting. So they go through these cyclical upswings. So Mondi's just one of those terrible businesses with an excellent management team, and it looks like the cycle is turning, and this looks like a very cheap entry point into that name.
Amazon and the hyperscalers, so Alphabet and Microsoft, in general, they've underperformed the NASDAQ quite materially over the recent while. There's just that lingering concerns around monetizing those hundreds of billions they're spending into AI. But sort of the results for me last week gave you that first sign that those returns are coming through now. So you saw AWS growth of 37%. That was the fastest in 18 quarters. And their backlog increased 2.5 times. But also, their core retail business is doing well. So it's cheap relative to history, but fundamentally, I think it's starting to look as though it shouldn't be. And I think that investor sentiment after this last results season could be shifting.
So, Caroline, Amazon, that's a no-brainer. That's a constant stock pick these days. But Mondi, I find, Kubus was talking about Mondi there. That's very interesting. What are you saying?
Yeah, I hear what he's saying. I think that a lot of us have Mondi trauma. Mondi trauma. We bought it just before, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And obviously, a lot of what happened to Mondi was affected by that. They had that big, I think about 20% of the company, which was tied up in Russia, which they ultimately had to let go. Everyone got a very nice special dividend from that, but it never really recovered. So I think that is the trauma. I understand there is a market for their types of products, but I also just don't think that market is growing a lot. And I also question the valuation of the share. I don't think it's particularly cheap considering that. So I would rather stay away.
Yeah, there was a bit of an uptick I saw at the end of that graph, but I see what you're saying. Now, for your stock pick, what are you looking at?
Okay, I'm going a little SpaceX-y. So it is Kathy Wood's funds, the ARKX. It's the Space and Defense Fund run by Kathy Wood's outfit, ARK. They've recently increased their exposure to SpaceX. It was about 8%. I don't know where it is now, but I know they bought last week as well. So if you've been wanting to actually get exposure in this area, it's probably a very nice place to do it. They also have other things in the it's a very broad defense theme, space exploration, defense, drones. So you also have things like Alphabet and Amazon in there as well. a couple of the chip makers like AMD as well. So it's a very, very diversified fund. I do believe these companies are going to be very volatile, but they are going to grow, and this is maybe a nice managed way to get exposure to them.
Now, just get your pennies in. That's what's quite expensive. Caroline, thank you so much. Great to chat to you once again on Business Lunch. And that was Caroline Cremen from AdviceWorx.